This morning we are gathered here for a very important assignment, and it is our first assignment for the year 2026. So if you're watching us, we want to welcome you all. Once again, let me now hand you over to our moderator for this morning, Mr. Winston Amwa. A round of applause for him.
Thank you very much, Kweku Obenje, for that introduction. So we know that for some time I've been having conversations about resource-backed currency, okay? And for many of you, you've become interested, particularly because we've started a conversation about how we can buy, sell gold to back our currency, to enhance the city's appreciation and still make losses. In the midst of all of that, we think it will be important to actually have a conversation on how we can restructure Ghana's monetary architecture. And that's why we're here this morning, to have a conversation about, resources and how we could use that to reconstruct Ghana's monetary architecture. But before we get into the lecture itself, let's welcome some brief remarks from the Executive Director of CPS, Dr. Edu Owusu-Sarkodie.
Thank you, Winston. Our honorable presenter, Professor Paul Alagi Dede, distinguished guests, the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of CPS, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our premises. The Center for Policy Scrutiny is a new generation think tank in Ghana dedicated to promoting high-quality research and advocacy that influences public policy. Since our inception about 5 months ago, CPS has conducted 3 major reviews. First, the 24-hour economy and accelerated export development program. Second, the 2026 budget statement and economic policy of the government of Ghana. And third, fighting terrorism in the Middle East and Africa. After the reviews, we then proceeded to hold public fora like this to solicit more ideas from relevant stakeholders in order to contribute to the public discourse on the effective implementation of these important policy documents. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today's gathering is the 4th in the series of events so far. This special forum on rich in gold, poor in liquidity, Omnidox, and the reconstruction of Ghana's monetary architecture marks another special occasion where we come together to brainstorm on how to address development challenges. The excellent article written by Professor Paul Alagi Dede advances a more structural diagnosis of the macroeconomic vulnerability of the country. Ghana, despite being one of the world's leading gold producers, the economy remains structurally liquidity constrained, recurrently exposed to foreign exchange stress, and dependent on external financing for stabilization. Therefore, the issue is not about scarcity, because we have gold in abundance. And I just learned yesterday that Alagi Dede means in abundance. But the architectural design that fails to translate real assets abundance into usable monetary capacity. Ghana has abundant gold. We are the leading producer of gold in Africa and number 6 in the whole world. The unconfirmed figure of gold production last year in 2025 was 5.1 million ounces of gold. Multiply this figure by the average international price of gold gives you $18.3 billion. Translate this into Ghana cedis as 234 billion Ghana cedis. And this amount, ladies and gentlemen, only gold export, this amount is more than total revenue and grants for the government last year. Because total revenue and grants stood at 230, and gold alone export stands at 234. So 4 billion cedis more than the government's total revenue and grants. It shows how important gold is to our economy. Again, gold accounts for 65% of our total exports. 65%, only gold. 65% of our total exports. Some attempts have been made in the past to get full benefits from gold. And at this point, CPS commends the originators of the Domestic Gold Purchase Program, within which we find the Gold for Reserves Program, which has contributed significantly to increasing the country's gold reserves from 8 tons in 2021 to 38 tons in 2025. Despite this progress made, reserve accumulation is still below our peers' level. Ghana produces similar gold with Mexico and Kazakhstan. And Mexico and Kazakhstan, they have over 120 tons of gold reserves, and Ghana has 38. So we need to do more. It is against this backdrop that the paper advances Omnidox, a metanomic framework that reframes macroeconomic analysis around asset stocks, balance sheets, and foreign convertibility rather than income flows alone. CPS is honored to have our distinguished Professor of Finance to share his paper with us. The findings and recommendations of this paper and presentation today will go a long way to shape public discourse around gold and liquidity. We are also grateful to have all of you here. I see my students and distinguished guests. We are grateful to have you here. Your support and participation mean a lot to us. As we embark on today's program, I encourage us all to engage, connect, and make the most of this opportunity. Let's create an atmosphere of collaboration, inspiration, and friendliness. Once again, I welcome you all to our premises, and I look forward to a memorable and successful strategy to improve liquidity using gold. Thank you, and good morning.
We can definitely do better. Another huge round of applause for him. Dr. Edu Owusu-Sarkodie is Executive Director for the Center for Policy Scrutiny, which means we can get into our presentation for this morning, to be done by a leading African economist and policy thinker whose work focuses on reimagining development, finance, and growth from an endogenous African perspective. He is the Bank of Ghana Chair in Finance and Economics at the University of Ghana, Professor of Finance at the University of Wits, and a founding scholar at the Nile Valley Multiversity. His research and policy engagements sit at the intersection of macroeconomic stability, domestic capital mobilization, trade, and infrastructure finance. He is widely recognized for advancing alternatives to orthodox development models that have left Ghana and much of Africa highly indebted, externally dependent, and structurally vulnerable despite vast domestic wealth. His work combines rigorous empirical analysis with institutional design, focusing on how African economies can finance growth using their own resources, natural, financial, and productive. He is the intellectual architect of metanomics and Omnidox, frameworks that underpin concepts such as resource-based monetary sovereignty, endogenous resource-backed currencies, and natural capital treasuries. These ideas inform current debates on domestic resource mobilization, debt sustainability, pension and insurance-led finance, and the reform of the global financial architecture, including ongoing work with multilateral institutions. Beyond academia, our presenter is actively involved in translating theory into practice through policy advisory work, institutional reform initiatives, and enterprise-based experimentation in finance, agriculture, infrastructure, and publishing. At today's lecture, he'll be speaking on alternative economic pathways for Ghana's development, focusing on how domestic capital, natural wealth, and institutional reform can be harnessed to achieve sustainable growth, resilience, and economic sovereignty. Let's welcome Professor Paul Alagidede with a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Winston. Director of the Center for Policy Scrutiny, Dr. Adu Owusu Sarkodie, distinguished guest. See my colleagues here, Kofi, and students. To the great ancestors of this land and the indigenous leaders, to those listening to us online, offline, and off-world. It's a great pleasure to be here to share with you some ideas of some of the work that I've been doing at the University of Ghana and also at the University of the Witwatersrand on how to reimagine the monetary architecture that African countries, not just Ghana, find themselves in. So we are at a very pivotal moment in our development as a nation and also as a continent. And so this lecture really is based on continuing work that we are doing, and looking specifically at gold, largely because of the interest that has been generated over the last few months concerning the work that the Gold for Reserve program has brought. We have all seen it in the macroeconomic indicators, significant shifts in the liquidity position of the country. And there is quite a lot of optimism about what is possible for us as a country. Now the question we've been asking is, why didn't we see this all this while? And so my work is really about providing us with the framework that will help us to analyze this. And this framework should be long-lasting enough for any group of people who have the capacity to run the country to take it to the next step. So today's lecture, I'll look at three main things, giving you the economic thought that underlies our development trajectory up to this point. I won't go too far, just after the immediate post-independence era up to now. So if you like, let's just focus on the last 60 or so years. I see this to be largely defined by two main ideas of economic development: the orthodox model and the heterodox model. I'll say a little bit more about that. And these models, my argument is that although they have been successful in many ways in giving us ideas about how to proceed with development and organize society, in some sense, they also have been quite limited in their ability, especially to take developing countries like Ghana, who are resource abundant, into high-level, sustainable, and steady-state growth. So they create what I call the paradox of scarcity in the midst of abundance. Then the second thing I want to discuss today really is about what I describe as the treadmill effect. That is, if we don't reimagine economic development and we stay with these two systems of economic thought, all that we've been doing is marking time. So that requires a reimagining of economic theory and philosophy, and that's what we introduce here in this lecture. I have titled it the Omnidox School of Metanomics, and that's a new framework in which we define the specific tools and instruments that are required to take the country to the next level of its development evolution. And then in the third stage of my contribution today in this lecture is really to look at specific policy options that will help our policymakers, be they the handlers of the economy or those measuring our national income, and also to introduce new things into our classrooms where we can teach a new brand of students who graduate into the policy-making space to do policy in a new way, part of my diagnosis has been that the problem we are facing is largely due to the kind of knowledge that we have been taught in the classrooms. And I'm also guilty of that. I have been regurgitating the same economics that I learned in school, and that has been what I see my students also implement in the various policy space. In this new era, we want to reimagine and think differently. So in this presentation, you will see the age of regeneration. I'll show you the three main schools of thought. The first school, if you like, you can also look at it as stages of economic thought, the evolution of economic thought. The standard economic theories we learned in the classrooms is what we call the orthodox economics, which is basically a reductionist approach to looking at national income, measuring growth. What it simply says that we only measure what we can see, feel, and touch. So all our discussions about gross national income or what constitutes growth is what we can physically measure and touch. So if you have resources like gold or cocoa, it's only when those resources are extracted and sold in the market that you can really value. And that's a very good way of looking at it. It has given us a lot of ideas about how to maximize welfare, how to measure, and look at development in many ways. There is another school that looks at it from another point of view, that the orthodox school has not actually been able to deal with things such as how do you explain why developing countries like Africa are stuck in the low-level equilibrium that they find themselves. So heterodox economists will always explain that institutional development matter for growth, which is ignored by orthodox thinkers. Things like colonialism and imperialism, resource extraction. There's quite a huge range of theories that come here. And they have also presented to us an alternative view. But really, both views, if you look at it, describe these as linear paradigms of economic thought. They have been excellent in guiding our development so far. But if we want to go to the next step and want to transcend where we have found ourselves, and I'll show you some statistics and data later on, we need to reimagine development in a new way. There was, or there has always been an African way or an indigenous way of measuring growth and of looking at development, which is rooted in the very resources that we have. So when I look at myself growing up in the north, in my village in Pungutelania, when you measure the total income of the society, you're looking at the number of cattle that you have, or perhaps chicken and guinea fowls, how many lands. The total GDP of the Pungu economy is also made up of how many people do you have around, the social capital, the connections and relationships, the contributions of women and men in society. What can be visibly measured and what cannot be so visibly measured is all included in the national income of that society. And the system is made up of a balance of society. So you hardly hear of widespread inequality in the midst of abundance. And that's the kind of economic system that we are talking about here. So within this system, the money is based on the resources that is owned by the society, whether extracted or not. So it's the total value of the wealth that we know today, not tomorrow or not in some past time. So the concept that we are talking about is living in the present moment. When you look at what the orthodox and the heterodox model does, it's always deferring the present to the future. So you're looking to extract into the future to realize your wealth potential. And we can just formalize this in terms of national income accounting to see what I'm talking about. The current system of national income is based on what we call the system of national accounting, which is the standard United Nations accounting system of measuring GDP, or gross domestic product, of countries. So you value the total market value of goods and services produced over a certain period of time, usually 1 year. Okay? The visible canopy is what that tracks mostly in the economy. That system of accounting ignores quite a number of things. Some of my colleagues have already pointed this out. In November, we had the African Review of Economics and Finance Conference. We had Professor Abino Drew, who pointed out the issues of unpaid care work, for instance. In our economies, women contribute quite a significant amount to national output, but most of it is completely ignored in the current system of national accounting. So it is with things like the informal economy. About 80% or so of our employment is generated from the informal sector in many African economies, not just in Ghana. And so it is with many things like our indigenous knowledge. We tend to look at the tourism and crafts, but we have quite a lot of spiritual wealth, social capital that escapes totally the system of national accounting. So our metanomics framework says that let's go a little bit beyond. So we are not throwing this away. Let's value all of this and include it and see what happens to our total output. It turns out that when you look at the current system that we use, which is the SNA, I call it, System of National Accounting, our GDP now, officially, it's around $82.31 billion. If you convert this to cities, we're just around 1.2 billion cities economy. That ignores all of these factors that I've already indicated. But if you move to the metanomic framework, you are looking at the asset base of the economy and also adding some of the unpaid work, indigenous knowledge system, and the informal wage that we don't account. So conservatively speaking, this data also exists. We just simply added it to what the national accounting system currently does not. And it turns out that we have a much larger economy than we are dealing with. So if you look at it, by shifting from the orthodox system of accounting, just change the accounting framework from flows, that is measuring current market prices, into stocks, you see an economy that is actually about 21 times more than what it is according to the system of accounting. Now, this is not my invention per se, but if you look at what Nigeria did a couple of years ago, just by changing the divisor, the GDP went up almost about 100%. Kenya did it. We did it here in Ghana. Those were tinkering with just the devices. But here I'm talking about adding what we are not yet accounting for. Okay? Now, if you look at the orthodox system of thinking, it would take us, in 2024 growth rate, about 5 years to reach roughly $100 billion economy. But if we are thinking in terms of what the indigenous way of looking at economic developments is, we are already $100 billion economy right now. So we don't need to wait for 5 years. That's all things equal. So that's the distinction that we are looking at. And this produces, if you go by the orthodox heterodox approach, we are simply on a treadmill, because over the past 60 or so years, the economy has been constantly looking out for liquidity buffers, whereas that liquidity is already within the economy. And this is the title of my paper, that in the midst of abundance of gold, we are liquidity trapped. According to the data that we have, Ghana has been to the International Monetary Fund about 18 times in the last 60 years. In fact, in the late 80s, it was much more regular, up to the 90s. In the last 35 years, since we've gone into democratic governance, we have visited the fund 10 times. If you look at what we have done with that, it works out to roughly an average of about 3.5 years of visit. And this has been an economy that at the same time has tremendous amount of resources that can be unlocked for domestic liquidity. So, yes, we can talk about the political problems, mismanagement, and etc. But in this particular presentation, what I'm hinting at is that the accounting system and the economic thought that is running the economy is one of the key problems that keeps us returning and looking outside for liquidity to finance an economy that is already rich. So I get what we call the paradox of locked granary. The current system of national accounting only counts our visible gold that leaves our shores, meaning that we are forced to borrow paper from abroad while sitting on a bedrock of wealth at home. So, speaking in real terms, Ghana is not a poor country. This is a very rich nation. It's a rich house with a locked door. We have been begging for bread on the streets while our granary is full, simply because we have lost that key to our balance sheet. And metanomics, I believe, is one of the keys that are present in this particular setting to enable us unlock the door of liquidity that will help the nation move forward. So orthodox economics tends to treat our resources simply as flow, something that we have to dig up and sell to pay off debt. But metanomics treat this as an asset. It's a permanent foundation for our currency, for our budget, and for our national development plans. So we can create our own liquidity without triggering inflation if that liquidity is anchored and verified in the resource that we have in abundance in this country, and that is the gold. So the sovereign dividend that we have has to be used, and we can see evidence of this all around us. Gold is one of the most important metals globally. In ancient Egypt, what we call Kemet, the land of the blacks, our ancestors used gold. In fact, it used to be called the flesh of the gods. And we see it today. When we migrated and left that land, we're looking only for lands that had abundance of gold. So in the West African gold curtain, from Ghana to Cote d'Ivoire to Burkina Faso to Mali, all that area is littered with gold. But when you see the largest concentration of gold, the richest gold vein is found right here on this land. In fact, some have valued our gold to be one of the richest in the world. You can get as much as 21 karat gold here. But the balance is that we have not been able to translate this gold into usable things. But elsewhere, this gold has made kingdoms, the crowns of kings and queens in different lands. But you also see it, we adorn our kings and queens here with gold. And when they come out, you see that this is a nation that is pretty rich in resources. Gold in my refers really not the yellow metal alone, but also the white metals, green metals, and other sources of black gold, if you like, the oil, and other resources that we have. So by unlocking these resources, we have a great potential for liquidity that can back our monetary system. In the history of the global monetary system, gold has played a very significant role. If you look at the classical gold standard, roughly around 1870s to 1900s, gold was the main metal that played that role. There were other metals later on, like silver, but gold played a significant role also in the Bretton Woods system, all the way up to the 1970s when the US dollar was pegged to gold, and thereafter it was allowed to float from 1971 onwards. So gold plays a very significant role as a store of value, as an inflation hedge. It can also be used as a portfolio diversifier and a strategic reserve asset, for that matter, for emerging market economies like Ghana. So when you look at the global landscape of gold, our executive director indicated, we are the 6th largest producer of gold in the world. And this is not a small achievement because Ghana is making roughly around 140 tons of gold in a year, depending on which measure you are using. And this particular gold has also, in terms of central bank reserves, we are actually done quite well in the last 5 years compared to the previous 60 years. And that gold reserve accumulation have been very aggressive in the last 5 years alone. So roughly around 38 tons is what is held in our reserves. The argument from the metanomics point of view is that we can do much, much better by keeping the gold right here rather than digging it, selling it for dollars, which we use to then support the reserves. So when you look at the balance sheet of Ghana in terms of gold, and I'm looking at some empirical data here using most recent statistics on what we know. Current gold price per ounce is around $4,500. And if we are working at the current exchange rates to the dollar around 10 or 11 dollars, we can see already we know the total proven reserves of gold in our soil is around 1,000 metric tons, which is valued around $146 billion or 1.5 billion Ghana cedis. So the argument in our paper is that if we can activate just around 40 to 60% of just the gold that we have alone, holding all our resources constant, assuming we don't have any other resource, cocoa, shea nuts, lithium, manganese, and others, what amount of fiscal space can we unlock for domestic liquidity creation to support currency and national development plan? So the illusion of poverty, as the table reveals, is that Ghana's in-situ gold, which is now valued around $1.5 trillion, is really quite significant. But when you look at it from the point of view of the orthodox way of thinking, this country is a poor country that constantly has to go for liquidity, not within, but outside. So the country's official reserves, that's currently only the portion that is currently liquid in the eyes of orthodox economics is just about 4%, that's 3.8 of the total value. The paradox is therefore we are considered insolvent or stressed by credit agencies because they ignore the 1.5 trillion that is right here in our land. It's under our feet, and they only look at the $60 billion in the central bank. That is a shift in economic thinking. So all that we need to do is just to shift our thinking from the orthodox and add one more layer, which is what we are talking about, the metanomics system. So the liquidity activation, which is our orthodox, Omnidox paradigm, is by activating 40 to 60% of equity of our in-situ reserves. We release, if we do that, we can release between 634 billion cedis to around 952 billion in fiscal space, just what we have already, not in the future, right now. So the fiscal comparison, if we have to put this in perspective, is that Ghana's total budget in 2024, which is around 26 billion, could have all been funded domestically without looking outside. Okay? That's the 2024 budget. So by activating about 50% of our in-situ equity, which is right under our feet, it's enough to fund about 4 years of national expenditure without borrowing a single peso from outside the country. So we're living in a very big paradox. A wealthy nation that is walking cup in hand, begging. It reminds me of the biblical story when the apostles were entering and they met the young man sitting and begging. They said, "We don't have anything to give you, but take up the gold that you already have," just to paraphrase, okay, and use it. So in recent time, we have seen quite a number of moves, which is signaling to strategic policy, shifts. That is towards what we are talking about, but it's still baby steps. The establishment of the gold board has been a success story in less than a year. And we have seen that if we just change the rules about how gold is treated. Currently, most of the large-scale mines just ship the gold out. It goes to support other currencies, and we have to go back and get that money back here. And so if you change the rules about how that is done, it just keeps the money right here. Again, if you also look at how we treat this very resource, what we are talking about is keeping the gold as our currency. I call it an anchor to the currency, not selling it and getting dollars, because the dollar is still a fiat currency. Okay, that's a distinction. So the gold board success has been able to mobilize, according to current data, around 10.8 billion. That's dollars. This is around 117 billion in a single year from just small scale and artisanal mines. Now we have to talk about the cost of doing that. Environmental economics will indicate that the externality inflicted on our rivers, on our water bodies and environment could be huge. Maybe this is a very important PhD topic for those of you who are wanting to study, because we haven't yet talked about that. But that's been going on for quite a long time. It's not just in the last few years. And so it is with the other costs associated with getting this. So we should bear in mind the effects of trying to get gold in the ways in which we do it. When I asked, how did our ancestors do it? And normally, they say, when you don't know, just ask Abdullah, okay? When you ask Abdullah, she will have the solutions. So they told me that there was a more sustainable way of getting the gold without all those huge machines, destroying the rivers and etc. So we probably need to go back and check that over 100 years ago, how were we digging the gold and taking it out of the land? And this could provide an inkling into what we can do with what we are doing with the current resurgence in the use of gold as an anchor for our currency. So in the age of regeneration, what we are talking about really is, look at the juxtaposition of the research that we have done, is that when you consider in the table here how to escape the treadmill that we have been on over the past 60 years, gold could provide a way out. So the rich in gold magnitude is that the total value of Ghana's gold is more than twice the entire national debt, which is now estimated around 648 billion cedis. So in the age of reductionism, which we call the orthodox system of thinking, this is seen as a mountain or gold debt that is in the ground is debt. But in the age of regeneration, in the context of what we're talking about in metanomics, this is a huge opportunity for balance sheet renewal and balance sheet financing. So the poor in liquidity resolution currently means that even though the nation is poor in liquidity because it simply struggles to finance its budget, annual budgets, which we have to constantly go and borrow. But by activating the gold, we can bring in a significant amount of resources domestically. So sovereign wealth activation and external dependency is really the choice that we have to make in our economic policy discussion. Are we going to continue to be governed by the rules of liquidity activation, or we will rather focus on looking within to collect the total amount that we already have? So if you still with me up to this point, there are quite a number of things that we can talk about as takeaway policy levers that policymakers can work with. At the statistical service, for instance, we need to think about how to revalue our national income. All the textbooks that we have studied in school so far have been all about accounting for flows. I'm saying let's add the stocks to what we have. So we are not throwing away the flow accounting system, simply account for the stocks of reserves that we already have right under your feet. So the statistical service must move beyond the visible canopy of market transactions to measure the roots of the economy. Adopt an asset-based system of national accounting, that is the GDP plus all the invisibles and unaccounted activities. Transition from the flow-centric system to the asset-based. This involves recognizing the true base of the economy, which is rooted in our metanomic calculations. We said that it's about 21% larger than what official records is saying when we include household production, informal undercount wage, and indigenous knowledge system. And then more importantly for the statistical service, we need to do a proper sovereign asset audit. This is very important. Kofi and I have been talking about asset tokenization. If you want to tokenize gold, we really need to verify these assets and be able to measure properly and get the correct stocks, and not just gold, but our land, our other resources that we have, timber, to establish a credit foundation for a true national balance sheet. From the central bank point of view, we have to also move gradually from borrowed economic doctrines that are based on looking externally for liquidity. So the central bank must shift from the current system of looking out and anchoring the economy more in the domestic asset base. We can operationalize this. We talk in the paper about the resource-based monetary sovereignty, which really means to take full control of our monetary system and root it in our indigenous natural resources that we already have here. And so we can also establish prudential guardrails that maintains the liquidity envelope through activated equity. And then at the Ministry of Finance, we must transition from managing the flows to managing the national balance sheet. This would give us a more leverage to manage the economy. So we are really at a crossroads where indigenous intelligence meets global algebra. By establishing natural capital treasuries and sovereign tokenization, we will be changing our accounting system and also reclaiming our soul and live really like rich people. Ghana is not a poor nation. It is a wealthy nation in a temporary state of amnesia, and it's time to wake up. So if we look at just the 10 billion that we have harvested last year alone, we can declare that the era of the wealthy pauper is officially over. Ghana is a gold superpower, and we must live and act as such. I thank you.